there are a variety of different types of white people with different kinds of concerns that voted for Trump. But the core of his support were people who had high levels of out-group hostility. And a lot of them, I think, were people who rely more on emotions, and they're more easily threatened, and they are more easily given to expressing their fears and their anxieties and their hate towards groups that they see as threatening.
And welcome to another episode of the Not Your Black Friends podcast. I'm Tia.
And I'm Spencer.
And today is actually a really special occasion because it is the 1-year anniversary of our podcast. Yay!
We'll edit
insert
sound
effects here. Exactly. So, actually, for our episode, we wanted to do something special since it was the 1-year anniversary. And this is lining up with the election that is taking place in when this airs, it'll be less than a week. And I wanted to bring in somebody that could just, talk to us about what we're seeing in politics, what's going on. And it ended up being none other than one of my absolutely favorite professors that I had in undergrad. I think it was the first time I took one of your classes, and then graduate school.
Right.
Dr. Sanford Schram, who is on the faculty in the political science department at Hunter College, CUNY, and in the sociology department at CUNY Graduate Center, where he teaches a doctoral program in political science. He's also active as faculty associate at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, which is a part of Hunter College. Sandy has written 6 books, co-authored 3, edited another, and co-edited 6 more for a total of 16 books. And we are going to talk to him about his latest book, co-written with Richard C. Fording. This book is called Hard White: The Mainstreaming of Racism in American Politics. So welcome to the podcast, Sandy.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tia and Spencer. Delighted to be here.
Well, we're delighted.
On your anniversary.
Yay, thank you. And thank you for taking time out of, I know, is a very busy schedule to speak with us about your book. So we might as well jump right in.
Okay.
So I think that over the past 4 years, a lot of us have noticed, and even before 4 years, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, have started noticing how certain language and ideas that we kind of thought were on the fringe have made it into the public discourse. So how do you define the mainstreaming of racism?
That's a great question. Yeah, we struggled with all of that. I mean, the United States has a long history of racism. The country was founded on racism. The Constitution was written to defend slavery. We struggled for centuries, really. Our entire 200-year plus history to deal with issues of racial division in the country. So we're not saying, oh, this is like the first time racism has become prominent in our politics. So, but we didn't want to call the book the re-mainstreaming of racism. It just didn't sound right. And also, I think what's happening now is very noteworthy. There are two things about this. One is we, for, I don't know, about 10 years, we've been tracking hate groups, largely relying on the Southern Poverty Law Center and other sources. And we've written about how white extremist groups were very disaffiliated from politics and they didn't really want to get involved. And but that began to change about 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago. You started to hear rumblings like we're never going to get anywhere unless we get involved in mainstream politics, and we're going to have to stop wearing robes, and we're going to have to start dressing properly and making allies. And so in our book, we talk about how white nationalist groups of various sorts were increasingly interested in getting involved in conventional mainstream politics, which they didn't really identify with because in the post-civil rights era, most politicians, even if they themselves were racist, didn't want to embrace those groups and didn't want to articulate that kind of rhetoric. But something happened. Barack Obama was elected president, and he was the first non-white president in the history of the country, and a lot of white people became anxious about how a black person was going to lead a federal government down the road to a more multicultural, inclusive democracy, and they might have to deal with accommodating other groups, and they weren't too happy about that. But especially when the Tea Party rose up, though the Tea Party might have been first about not wanting to support Obama's efforts to deal with the Great Recession and spend a lot of money to bail people out and have a stimulus and all of that and recovery. But it quickly became a change in what scholars call the political opportunity structure. It created an opportunity for white nationalist groups to get involved in the mainstream. And over time, the Tea Party became dominated by racial considerations, and their rhetoric began to change. So people like Michelle Bachmann, who was one of the leaders of the Tea Party, over time, she wasn't just talking about taxes. She was talking about banning Muslims and so on. And so that's the second part of it. So the first part is, the extremists, they started to get involved in mainstream politics with a change in the political opportunity structure as witnessed by the Tea Party. But their rhetoric also started to get involved too. And we show in the book that they not only got involved, but then people like Michelle Bachmann started to talk like them. And so there is a migration, not just of the people, but also their rhetoric into mainstream politics. And it was becoming more common to say outrageous things. And I think the second big change here is not just the migrating of the people and the rhetoric into mainstream politics, but the focus. It's no longer black versus white. It's no longer African Americans as the target outgroup. Now, in an age of globalization and immigration and cultural and ethnic diversification, there are really a constellation of outgroups that white people are anxious about. And we identified that the three that were the most significant here were African Americans, of course, but also Muslims and Latino immigrants, which sometimes spills over into just how you feel about the Latinx population generally. And what we found was not only was there a migration of extremists into mainstream politics through the Tea Party, into the Republican Party, and not only their rhetoric, But then the leaders of the Republican Party started to rail about these outgroups, even before Trump came on the scene. We found, and that this, and I think the last thing I would add here is that it not only involved the fringe and their rhetoric getting involved in the mainstream, it also involved mainstream people now feeling more authorized when their leaders start to use this language to express their suppressed feelings about how, oh, we don't really want a multicultural democracy and share power with non-white groups. And basically, that's sort of what's happened over the last 20 years, is the mainstreaming of racism in that sense. Mainstreaming of a white hostility towards outgroups is what's happening.
Yeah, I loved that was the tagline of the book, the mainstreaming of racism in American politics, because even though a lot of it focuses in on Trump and how he's been able to harness sort of like the structure that the Tea Party had already set up, which we can talk about later. But I like that you talked about that it's into American politics. It's not just like Trump came along and then did all of this by himself. The structures had been starting to come in place. Like this was all, like you said, for the past 20 years. This was all sort of building up on the fringe and then slowly coming into the mainstream.
Right. It's kind of like a perfect storm. So a lot of this started to increase after 9/11. And so there's the concern about Muslims as terrorists, but there's also the concern about Mexicans as illegal immigrants, and as well as African Americans as being a costly drain on society because we have to spend all this money on welfare and criminal justice. And those are the big themes that we found that Tea Party candidates started to emphasize, and that it ended up getting picked up on Trump. I think Trump, of course, has a history as a racist. Mary Trump's book is an eye-opener about how his family was profoundly, explicitly racist. And Trump, of course, his hatred of the Central Park Five and can't be explained any other way. He's just like is like a knee-jerk racist. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, Trump's main goal in life is to be loved by everyone, that he's great and famous. He's such a narcissist. I mean, he's really pathological, right? And it's really dangerous. And so that makes him like an opportunistic racist. So he'll just be a racist because this stuff was bubbling up. Mm-hmm. He got tutored by Steve Bannon. Before he decided to run, he would do these podcasts like this with Steve Bannon for Breitbart. And if you listen to those podcasts as opposed to this one, you'll see that Bannon isn't just asking Trump questions. He's like feeding him answers about how to think like someone who's going to stand up for white America. And Trump sort of goes, oh, okay, I can do that. Yeah. And he's like being tutored in how to be a demagogue. And he ended up opportunistically saying, okay, that's my base. I'll go with them. And it kind of reminds him, I guess, of his family and his childhood. And so he's comfortable with it. It makes him more dangerous, I think. And so he exploited a pre-existing movement and the alt-right and all these extremist groups and people being mad about changing society. But he's taken it to another level. And that's why our book ends up concentrating on him, because even if it didn't start with him, he kind of blew the lid off it.
Mm-hmm. So let me back up just a little bit. I think that in 2016, of course, a lot of us were surprised that he won. But I think that the reason why a lot of us were surprised, not just the fact that, he didn't have a political history, he seemed kind of ignorant to the structure and working of politics, if you will. Well, at least, not necessarily politics, but how the government works. You seem kind of ignorant to that. And so I think a lot of us were surprised, but the biggest thing was the language that he used, and that it was, sometimes dog whistles, sometimes flat out, racist language. And so a lot of us were surprised that a person could be talk like this so openly and be elected.
Right.
And so in your book, you say that he was able to harness votes from racial extremists, but at the time in 2016, the U.S. was less racist overall.
Right. Well, yes and no. So, yes, the book, we're very proud of this finding that actually has been confirmed by other people who we agree with about this topic, and some who we disagree. I think there's a general consensus among people who've been studying this that this white anxiety about outgroups or non-whites has been increasing for like about 20 years. And very much a post 9/11 thing, very much a post Obama election thing. Michael Tesler calls it the Obama effect. That Obama's, ironically, the main effect of his presidency was to stir up white hostility. And so this has been developing for a long time. And on the other hand, we also argue in the book that American racial politics historically and American politics generally tends to be cyclical. So one movement tends to counter another. So you have the civil rights movement, and its ultimate achievement ends up being the election of Obama over time. And then this white nationalist movement really starts to spill into mainstream politics by then. And it's a counter movement. And that's like an Obama effect. Now we're starting to see a Trump effect, where a lot of white people, when he was starting to run, were very concerned. I mean, traditionally, political scientists like Tali Menderberg and others have emphasized that when you are explicitly racist, you tend to turn off American voters in recent decades. And so you have to dog whistle, as scholars have called it. And the reality is Trump now is forcing us to revise that. So, yes, a lot of people were turned off by Trump. And so the average, starting in 2016, in how people felt about outgroups was moderated. That's because, what was going on is, and this is where Trump forces a revision. Now, if you're explicitly racist, we understand, well, yes, you'll turn off some people, but you'll also turn on some other people, especially people on the fringe. They'll come in to the mainstream and participate in politics. And so we need to revise Tali Menderberg's emphasis on dog whistling to say, no, I mean, and I think that's what Trump did. So the overall level of outgroup hostility among whites has been declining in recent years, ever since Trump started to show up on the scene, and some people were turned off, but other people are being mobilized. And so it's not that outgroup hostility is increasing, we say in the book, it's becoming more polarized.
Okay. Yeah.
Where some people are against outgroups and other people are for them.
I think for me, I'm just thinking about these past 4 years, and just thinking about how it was sort of in my head, how did Donald Trump how did we as a country go from electing a black president to electing a racist? And I think what I didn't understand was that there were so many folks on the fringe that or how do we go from electing Barack Obama as the first black president to electing someone who uses all these racial terms? And it's because he was able to attract folks that hadn't been voting and hadn't been participating because they were so far on the fringe that they didn't think any candidate spoke to what they
Right.
cared about.
Yeah, I no, that's a very important point. A main thing in our book, right, is that it's all about mobilizing your side and not trying to convert people or persuade people. So, in a highly polarized political environment where things are so racialized and people respond in a tribalistic fashion of us versus them, there's not a lot of good money to be spent trying to convince the other side to change their views. So, for instance, when Trump was elected, people wanted to know about Obama Trump voters, people who voted for Obama but then switched to Trump. And there were some. Our research shows that about 10% of all of Trump's voters in 2016 were Obama Trump voters who had voted for Obama but then switched and voted for Trump. And you could say, well, maybe they were persuaded. Now, the first thing about that is that that's about the normal amount of switching that happens in a presidential election. So Trump wasn't any better at getting people to switch than anybody else. So the idea that Obama Trump voters won him the election is wrong. And it wasn't even part of their strategy. If you talk to Brad Parscale, and we quote him in the book, the head of Trump's ingenious digital campaign, that he said they didn't spend really any money on persuasion ads on Facebook and so on and on the internet. They spent all their money on get out the vote ads. So it wasn't about trying to get people to switch through persuading them. It was about mobilizing your side by getting them agitated in terms of their outgroup hostility and getting them mad. And so, yes, I think political scientists generally were shocked and were wrong in their predictions about whether Trump would even be a credible candidate, let alone win. And we thought that his explicit racism would disqualify him. And we were wrong about all these things, and that includes me. And now, T, as you know, like for most of my career, I've studied race, but mostly how it plays a role in public policy, especially social welfare policy. I didn't really study elections that much, but like most political scientists, I had to study it in graduate school. So Rich and I, felt like we had to go back to our graduate school days because we were very concerned about how political science generally, including us, were missing what was going on. We didn't understand that not only were there a lot of people on the fringe that wanted to get involved in politics and express their racial hostility in this new form towards these outgroups, there were also a lot of people in the mainstream who were reluctant to say how they had these hostile feelings, but now started to feel more authorized. And so in this highly polarized environment, you start to see people on the right, conservatives who have these racial attitudes in particular, starting to become more vocal and more supportive of Trump in ways that I think caught all of us off guard.
Yeah, definitely. You want to ask a question?
Sure. I'll jump in. So, I know in the book you cited that some people, especially commentators like Van Jones, called Trump's victory a white lash against Obama's 8 years. But through your research, you found that racial extremist views were at their highest in 2012 and came down in 2016. So that might seem counterintuitive to some of us because we would think that racial extremist viewpoints would have been strongest in 2016 when Trump was elected. So how do you explain this?
Right. Well, yeah, this is another way of asking the same question. You guys are getting right into this really major finding of ours. So again, what happened was that Trump, I think, accidentally discovered that if you say the quiet part out loud, a lot of people with suppressed or marginalized attitudes towards outgroups would rally around you. And so he got those. And you could say outgroup hostility increased among the extremists and the racially conservative. So the extremists were largely alienated. They weren't that involved in politics. But now they got this candidate who's not like Romney and he's not like McCain. He's willing to say the quiet part out loud. They're really excited. They get involved in mainstream politics. But then the racial conservatives, people who weren't as racist, I guess, as the way we measure it, they already involved in mainstream politics, a lot of them, in voting, but they wouldn't ever openly, publicly acknowledge that they had these concerns, and they started to express them more. So on that end, I think there was a white lash. On the other hand, because Trump was saying the quiet part out loud, and in some ways Tolly Mendenberg is still right, when you do that, a lot of white people and other people are turned off, and so they became more supportive of outgroups, almost in defense. So it's like one movement countering the other. The Obama effect leading a lot of white people to express outgroup hostility, and then the Trump effect leading a lot of other whites to say, no, we like outgroups. We're not going to say negative things about them. And so the average between the two groups went down. Even though, so it's not strictly a white lash where just the whites react to Obama. It's not that outgroup hostility in that sense is just simply increasing. Instead of it increasing, it's becoming more polarized. Yeah.
All right. You know what I want to talk about? The Tea Party, because I think what happened with me was I thought, I remember them popping up after Obama was elected, and Sarah Palin and the "Don't Tread on Me,"
Right.
and some, I from time to time you still see people with those "Don't Tread on Me" flags, especially out in the county that we live. I see them from the bumper stickers from time to time, or somebody's house. But just from time to time, I really thought the Tea Party had kind of like come and gone. Can you talk a little more about how, and I know that it's in the book where you talk about how the Tea Party was able to, the Tea Party did not necessarily start out as having these like racial undertones to it.
No.
It really was more almost like libertarian, in the sense of like, less government interference, less taxes. Can you talk about how that was able to appeal to basically racial extremists?
Right.
How they
infiltrate?
Yeah,
so it's a great question. So there's a new book out by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson called "Let Them Eat Tweets." And it's about the rise of Trump. And they argue that Trump is the latest proponent on the right of what they call plutocratic populism, which is where elites like the Koch brothers, right, encourage ordinary people to blame outgroups for their economic problems and so on. And then the elites get off scot-free and they get to stay in power. And so they see the Tea Party as the primary example of this, developing back in the day when Obama was president, and they see the Tea Party as largely a creature of the Koch brothers, that it was an astroturf movement, not a grassroots movement. It was top down. It was paid for by them, and they were largely pursuing this libertarian, anti-federal government, anti-tax, anti-regulation agenda. And I think all of that's true. But our book is very different than Jacob and Paul's book. We say that the Tea Party was both an astroturf and a grassroots movement. So it might have started out as an astroturf movement where the Koch brothers were paying for everything and they had Richard Army and his organization organizing the events. But people really started to identify with it, and people like Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann got attracted to it, and a lot of people got involved, including white nationalists. And they saw it as what we call, relying on other scholars, a change in the political opportunity structure. The Tea Party created an opening where people could get involved. They could, sort of colonize the Tea Party and take it over and move it in this more racist direction. So it wasn't just that they didn't like Obama and they didn't like Obama's federal government and taxes and so on. They didn't like Obama's federal government taxing white people to pay to support black people, as Rick Santorum famously said, and when he was running for president as the Tea Party darling. And of course, back then, that ruined his candidacy because he the quiet part out loud and he denied he said it.
Right.
I played the tape over and over again, and he said that, and so you can see how it starts out as one thing and becomes another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think that's what people don't necessarily like realize. Like some of those things, that far as like the reasons why people want you to spend less tax money. Of course, it seems like, oh, well, more money in your pocket, and you can have more choice of how you spend it. That there are people that are saying, like, actually, I want more money in my pocket because I don't want to help those like freeloaders, or like limited federal government. Like, I don't want the federal government snooping in. Well, the federal government has often said to folks in states, no, you cannot discriminate on people based on race or sex and things. So it's like, for those that see it as, oh, I'm, voting on the right, or I'm more conservative leaning because I want fewer government, less federal government oversight. It's like, well, when there's been less federal oversight, those groups, like those out groups, if you will, whatever the out group is from time to time, it usually suffers.
Right.
Because when there's not that oversight,
No,
take advantage. So
yeah, and it's really gotten bad, and it's really intensified. At the end of our book, we highlight the research by other people that shows that whites that have high levels of outgroup hostility are less supportive now of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
See democracy, like majority rule, as including other groups and that they're gonna have to share power with, and they don't want to do that, so they're willing to say, "Well, get rid of democracy then, and just turn it over to our strongman Trump, and he'll defend us and make America, or keep America great again, or what have you, for white people." And this is very scary.
It is very scary.
Yeah.
Very scary.
Yeah, and this election is about that now.
Yeah.
I think
It is very scary that folks would be willing to give up democracy because they'd be willing to because they don't want the out group to be able to vote, or in their case they feel like they're going to take over or whatever. When you're talking about this mainstreaming, I can't help but think about how it has affected legislation. Of course, like, we can think about, immigration policy and, what Trump put forward and was defended, like he wanted a total Muslim ban, certain Muslim countries. And then it was upheld in court. I don't think all the countries were upheld, but in general, it was upheld by the Supreme Court. And it's just interesting to me because I've been thinking about, with the passing of John Lewis and the fact that before he passed, he was working on another Voting Rights Act, right, to get that passed. And just the fact that it hasn't kind of makes me think like, like maybe, this mainstreaming it's so insidious. Like, I don't know if that's a part of it. I don't know if that's another reason why it hasn't gotten passed. But, if there are people talking about, I'm okay with democracy not being a thing anymore, I can't imagine that there are also some constituents that are like, telling their congressperson, I don't want a new Voting Rights Act because it's given, I don't know, disproportionate help to black people to vote or something. Like, I don't know, but I can see how
No.
it could be something that's been argued, or that it's
I
something.
no, I think that's what's going on. And in fact, in today's New York Times, these two political scientists who've written a very, very important book came out about 2016, I think, entitled "How Democracy Dies." Daniel Zinblatt and Levetsky, their book. Is basically about this. And their op-ed today in the New York Times says that the election is about deciding whether we're going to have a multiracial democracy. And if we reject that, we're not going to have any democracy. So the choice is between Biden's party, which is a multiracial coalition committed to a multiracial democracy, which is, the United States has a history of its democracy being less than perfect in many ways, but still, a multiracial coalition for a multiracial democracy, and the opposition, which says, like Senator Mike Lee from Utah saying, well, democracy is not even that important.
Right. Yeah. I could
Getting
not
very explicit about it.
that. It was a tweet. He tweeted this.
Yeah, and so that's the choice now. So we have one party that's standing up for democracy, and the other one says, well, we don't really want democracy. And the quiet part is because white people will have to share power with other groups. And so this op-ed is saying, like, we either stand up for multiracial democracy or we're not going to have any democracy at all.
Right, so this is a related question that I guess will allow us to continue down this line of discussion. But we know some liberal or moderate people will hear the racist statement and lies that are being pushed through this administration and feel that we need to hear them out or try to find some middle ground. But you say that it's not the best tactic to fight racism. What do you suggest?
So Eddie Guide, who teaches African American studies at Princeton, has a new book out about James Baldwin. I think it's called Begin Again. And it's about how Baldwin enables us to understand our racial politics today. There's a very moving conclusion to the book where he goes to the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery. I don't know if you guys have been there, but Rich and I went there.
Actually, I have. Where was it? Yeah, it's a museum, right? Is it in Birmingham or is it in Montgomery?
Well, the museum is in Birmingham. The memorial's in.
Oh, okay. I've been to the museum.
So the memorial is very new, and people are going to it. And I encourage you guys to go to it. It's incredibly moving. It's really a gigantic work of art, and it's very sad too. It's about the history of racial subordination in the United States. And I don't want to give too much away, but by coincidence, Rich and I went there last summer, not in 2019, when we were still writing the book, and it was very moving and it influenced us. By coincidence, Eddie Guide's book ends with him describing how he reacted when he went there more recently than us, around the same time, basically. But and so I really was taken by his book. His book is very powerful and moving, and I encourage you to read it. So there's that coincidence. But the second coincidence is he comes to the same conclusion as us that Spencer just mentioned, that there's no sense in trying to persuade racists to stop being racist. And he concludes exactly as we conclude our book. Trump was able to win by mobilizing his side, getting white racial extremists to get involved in politics and join in support of his campaign with other people already in the mainstream expressing their hostile views. And the only solution is what Eddie Guide says, and what we say is we have to do the same thing. We have to mobilize our side. And that's how you're going to beat this back. And it's already started to happen, I would argue. So in the last chapter of our book, you might have noticed, if you saw that we studied the blue wave of 2018, and Democrats rose up and participated in a high turnout election for an off-year midterm election, and won 40 seats in the House and took back the majority and installed Nancy Pelosi as a majority leader. And our research shows that the main factor that led to the rise of the blue wave was how white racial liberals with low levels of outgroup hostility increased their participation and joined with non-whites in electing Democrats, mobilizing that side, right? And now we have a new article that's coming out in the Journal of Race and Ethnicity and Politics, and which says that the George Floyd protests are very distinctive because they were more multiracial than previous protests like Ferguson and so on.
We're
In reaction to
smiling.
police brutality.
Protests, and we were surprised with how many young white people were out. Basically,
Yeah.
we went to a protest around George Floyd and
Right.
Breonna Taylor.
Right. And so
Say yes, I was surprised.
We
were
were
we
very
were the
surprised.
minority at a at a march for
right.
you know,
And that's great.
right. So that's yeah.
It's very exciting, we argue in the article, because when white people get involved in the cause, that means that that lends more credibility to it, to the white population generally. It's not just aggrieved African Americans pleading with whites to understand how police brutality is so racistly administered in this country, and it says that white people are willing and prepared to do something about systemic racism and their involvement in it. And so we also argue in this new article that this shows you how protest politics and electoral politics, which are often studied separately, are really interrelated. And so a lot of the protesters are voters now. And so in the 60s, when there was a lot of the Black rebellion against police violence, was often largely young African American males who were trying to make a statement, you could argue, to a more racially mixed electorate. So they were like, who were older and so on. And the protesters were one group and the voters were another group. Now the protesters are the voters. The blue wave voted in the midterm elections and turned around and joined the George Floyd protests, we argue. And I think it's spilling over into this election. And we're seeing record turnout now in early voting. It's amazing. I predict by Wednesday, the country will have more voters already voting this time than the total turnout of the.
Wow.
And Biden's probably going to win a historic landslide, and the Democrats.
I'm scared.
The Democrats are going to take the Senate and keep the House. So I predict they're going to pick up about 25 more seats in the House. They're going to pick up 12 seats, 10 to 12 seats in the Senate, and they're going to win the presidency because of this multiracial coalition that's standing up for multiracial democracy, and hopefully is going to save us all.
I do hope so.
Yeah.
So our book was really sad to write, but it has a very happy conclusion.
So
So
know,
we'll see. We'll see.
now this is a little controversial, but I had to get into it. So, I'll be honest, in liberal circles, I have heard some people write Trump voters off as, at best, lowly and poorly informed, low education, at worst, just kind of stupid. Can we talk about how this isn't, necessarily the case that they're just like flat out stupid? I want to ask you if you could just talk about what you found as to be besides, just flat out racist ideas. What has been the connection with Trump voters regarding what drove their decision making to vote for him?
Right. So the Trump coalition we show in the book, of course, is very diverse among white people. So it's not racially diverse or ethnically diverse so much as it is. It has different elements. So a lot of diehard Republicans voted for Trump because he was the Republican nominee. A lot of conservatives voted for him for ideological reasons. A lot of evangelicals voted for him because they're pro-life. A lot of gun advocates, people voted for him for gun rights. A lot of people voted for him for economic reasons. They want less taxes. They want less regulation. And so, there are a variety of different types of white people with different kinds of concerns that voted for Trump. But the core of his support were people who had high levels of outgroup hostility. And a lot of them, I think, were people who rely more on emotions and they're more easily threatened, and they are more easily given to expressing their fears and their anxieties and their hate towards groups that they see as threatening. And I think one of the things we found, this was the first thing that got us started on this in 2016. On election day in the Washington Post, we had an op-ed that reported on our original research that showed that a core of the Trump coalition of all these different people were people who didn't really have a lot of knowledge about politics, and they weren't really thoughtful people. They had what psychologists call a low need for cognition. And because they didn't use a lot of logic and reasoning and facts to make decisions, they relied more on their emotions and especially their fears and anxieties about outgroups. And so we found that a core of Trump's voters were pretty ignorant about things, and therefore were more willing to give Trump a pass for his lies and his misunderstandings about, say, like how trade works. He has no idea. He actually believed, he said last night in the last debate, that he still believes that he's forced China to pay billions of dollars in tariffs. They don't pay the tariffs. The U.S. consumers pay the tariffs.
Right.
When we buy Chinese products that have these extra charges on, so he's pretty ignorant about these things and stubborn about it. He won't correct himself. And a lot of low information voters, as we call them, with low need for cognition, are vulnerable to believing him and are willing to go along with his lies and are more easily led to rely on their emotions. And so when he makes emotional appeals about outgroups, they buy into that the outgroups are the cause of their problems. And Trump, so our research showed that in the past, recent presidential elections, people who don't know a lot about politics and don't think a lot and rely more on their emotions tended to split their votes. But Trump was able to corral the low information vote. And he got them all, they all joined over to him and they identified with him. And so he got the stupid vote in that sense. I know it sounds, but those weren't his only voters. He got a lot of intelligent, thoughtful, conservative people to vote for him too, and that's its own controversy. But he got a lot of ignorant people to vote for him, and you see this now, like a huge portion of the Republican Party. I would say like a fifth to a third of the Republican Party, a quarter to a third, I would say, are like adherents to QAnon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It's amazing. So a huge number of the Republican Party now not only backs Trump, but believe that the Clintons eat babies.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm so glad you mentioned QAnon because I want to people actually believe that stuff. It's shocking.
Yeah.
I'm still just like yeah. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, throughout the book you kind of talk about the role that social media, but in particular Facebook and Twitter, played on Trump's election. And so how was social media able to help Trump more than Hillary? Or if I ask this another way, how did Trump use this to his advantage?
Right. It's a fascinating story. So, and it's really poignant to be talking about it now after Brad Parscales lost his job this time for the Trump campaign and got arrested, possibly for being suicidal and for attacking his wife, and he's probably facing criminal prosecution. On the day Parscales, the former head of the digital operation for the former head of the campaign in 2020, but the head of the digital operation in 2016, when he got arrested in Florida last month, was the same day that the BBC announced that the British Parliament was releasing evidence that, in fact, the Trump campaign had colluded with Cambridge Analytica to spread malicious conspiracy theories and lies to black voters to suppress the black vote for Hillary. Now, Parscales had denied that they had done this, but evidently what's coming out now is that, and we discussed this in our book, that some people had been suggesting, in spite of his denials, that one of their successes that they denied was to rely on Cambridge Analytica to do the dirty work and using Facebook to get African American voters to not vote for Hillary. Now, we don't know to what extent that was actually took place, but it's starting to come out that, and we said in the book, we're not really sure, and we don't know to what extent it was successful, though we go over our research that shows it might have been somewhat successful. But the bigger story was, again, not suppressing the vote, but mobilizing whites on the extreme. And Parscales was never involved in electoral politics before this. He made web pages for the Trump organization to sell things. And Trump, just in Trump fashion, goes, "Oh, you know how to make web pages. Let's put you in charge of the digital operation for the campaign." And the guy's a fast learner. So he worked with Facebook, and I think he revolutionized political advertising. So it moves from television to the internet to Facebook. And he used these Facebook algorithms, lookalike audiences, and so on, so that they sample a few people and they find out, that they like Trump. And then they use the data that Facebook has of like millions of other people. And they compare the millions of people to the few people, like 1,000 people that they surveyed. And they see that they bought the same stuff, or they have the same likes on Facebook. And so these are called lookalike audiences. And so they identify millions of possible Trump supporters this way. And then they feed them lies and conspiracy theories and Trump tweets to gin them up in terms of their outgroup hostility, especially in swing states, because they knew they couldn't win the popular vote, so they just wanted to flip a few swing states, which Brad Parscales admitted to the day after the election on a recorded interview on NPR. So you can listen to that, where he says, yeah, we knew we were going to lose the popular vote. We just concentrated on swing states, and we appealed to people who normally don't vote. But we identified as being likely to support Trump. And they mobilized them in terms of their anxieties. And we show in chapter 9 that they succeeded to do that. So we show that the main reason that turnout increased in swing states, but not in non-swing states, for Trump, was people's levels of outgroup hostility. And so they honed in on these people that normally didn't vote. They didn't like Romney. They didn't like McCain. They weren't speaking to them and their racism. But they liked Trump, and they were able to mobilize them in these swing states where they concentrated these ads. And we say in the book that the Trump campaign ran about 66 million ads on Facebook, right? Because you could just change a little bit. They're called like dark posts, where they're tailored to each person and their profile, and they change it. And Hillary ran I think 50,000 ads on Facebook. 66 million versus 50,000.
Right. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
Especially ads that are tailored to
right.
specific interests.
So it's a sad story that Brad Parscales then got promoted because he was so successful. He became in charge of the whole campaign this time. But then when he started to show Trump polling data that showed Trump was behind, Trump got mad at him and threatened to sue him, which is a weird thing to do. Somebody brings you bad news, you go, I'm going to sue you. And then he fired him. and then Brad Parscales melted down. And so he went from being this critical genius that helped Trump win to being now, I think he's in a mental institution at the moment.
Wow.
Hopefully he'll get better, but it's a sad story. I felt he was arrested because we studied him so closely. I felt like I knew him.
Right.
I've never met him, but yeah, they did revolutionize how to use Facebook to gin up outgroup hostility in swing states, and we show in the book that they in fact did that, and then they won.
Another thing you said in the book that I really loved was that how kind of how Twitter is the perfect format for someone like Trump, because is a limited amount of words,
right?
So that doesn't you can't. There's no room for citing sources and providing evidence, and it's just a soundboard where people can just run off at the mouth and you say whatever and tweet things, and it's sort of the perfect platform for a person like him with his personality and his goals of how he attracts his followers and talks to his base. Right.
So Parscales used Facebook to identify potential Trump supporters and then fed them Trump tweets because Trump uses Twitter to gin up the base, especially in the swing states. And so it was a perfect combination. Trump tweeting on Twitter and Parscale using Facebook, and they were really able to gin up the base and in terms of people's white hostility towards outgroups and get them to show up and mobilize them and get them to vote. And that's how they won. And, Trump was interviewed by, he had that town hall with Savannah Guthrie about 2 weeks ago. And it was incredible where she said, well, you shouldn't be retweeting white nationalists and white supremacists. She goes, you're the president of the United States. You're not somebody's crazy uncle. And Trump said in response, he goes, that was a retweet. And I retweet a lot. And so he was kind of,
Does it make it okay?
Right.
he was kind of like saying it makes it okay because
Right.
I was just retweeting, and I do that regularly, retweeting white supremacists.
Right.
He goes, let the people decide if it's true. And I mean, he retweets QAnon
Yeah.
tweets. So he loves to retweet extremist views. And he thinks that exonerates him because he didn't say it. They said it. And he does it all the time. But in fact, whether it exonerates him or not, he's implicated in the mainstreaming of racism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It just baffles me. Like, part of me is like, it's like, how is this an acceptable answer for people to be like, well, I just retweeted. And
He's not very sharp. Trump is not very smart. I mean, he has this sort of like feral political geniusness. He knows
he has emotion.
he knows how to promote himself. Yeah, right. And he knows how to lie about it and all that and everything. And he he has that sort of like sixth sense. But he's kind of stupid in the sense that he thinks like, oh, I'm just retweeting white nationalists, so I'm exonerated from that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's sad that he thinks that that's a plausible answer to say as president of the United States to an interviewer. That's really sad.
And of course, he has nobody in his camp that could challenge him or he'd fire them. And his
Right.
loves him no matter what. I mean, as he said, he could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and, it wouldn't affect him at all. So,
Unfortunately, that's probably true. He wouldn't lose any support. But his support is, not enough, I think, this time.
Yeah, I'm hoping
He's losing support of white women in suburbia in particular that he keeps complaining about. He said, please like me. And they're turned off by the racism. He's losing a lot of support among non-college educated white women who are offended by just how cruel and how vulgar and how racist he is. And he's losing a lot of support among college educated white men who tend not to support him anyway that much, far less than non-college educated white men. But so he's losing some constituency. And of course, he's losing a lot of elderly support because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he kind of left elderly people out there to die, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, that's how I felt. Like it was, once it was always kind of said, or at least very early on, it was said that, people with pre-existing conditions and elderly are very vulnerable. And then on top of that, it was put like, I think like Black and Latino especially were vulnerable.
right, as
I
well as
think
Native Americans.
and Native Americans.
Oh, yeah.
And I felt like once that statistic came out, it was over. Folks were like, we need to open up our state. They're there with the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, and we need to open up. And why?
No, our politics have not only become polarized and tribalistic, they've become highly racialized, and even the pandemic has been racialized. And a lot of his white supporters, QAnon type people, they don't seem to care about it. Like, don't wear a mask, don't social distance. And part of it is because they tend not to know anybody that works on the front lines. And those people are more likely to be people of color. And people of color are much more likely to have family members who have died.
Yeah.
And so it's most unfortunate that even the pandemic is being politicized in a highly racist way.
Yeah.
It's very sad.
I want to ask one more question, and then I'll open it up in case Spencer has any more. But
okay.
So I really enjoyed this part of the book because you spend a lot of time talking about the impact of language, particularly how racism shows up in language, and its impact on mainstreaming racism in the political discourse. I have heard, some folks say, Trump's not racist. He's just, telling it how it is. But you you show the research in the book that you and Rich analyzed, his speeches and compared them to speeches of Obama, Hillary. I think Mitt Romney was another.
Right.
What was it about Trump and how he talks and how he speaks that can help fuel that fire of that negative outgroup sentiment?
Well, again, he has this feral sixth sense of how to. Ivanka says her father is a counterpuncher. And that's her euphemism for saying he's willing to do anything to win. And that's just the way Trump has run his life. So other people wouldn't say the quiet part out loud. Everybody in the Republican Party is known for years, right? That part of their base is racist and kind of don't want to admit it, but they don't want to give it up, right? And Trump's willing to go, no, we're going to shout it out from the rooftops and get more support, and we're going to mobilize the fringe and bring them in. And so our research showed that he was willing to use push button words, right? Words that would push people's buttons way more than other Republican candidates in 2016 or Romney or his opponent Hillary Clinton. He would, like look at his commencement, not commencement, I'm too academic, his inauguration address, which was written by Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, and they called American Carnage, right? It's like he's inaugurated as president, and there's like this American carnage must end, right? And he's talking about how like the inner city is destroyed, it's not safe, you should never go to Baltimore, no human would live there, right? He said that about Elijah Cummings' district, which includes mostly a suburb of Baltimore, and he what he was saying is black people are not human, right? And no human would live there. It's a rat infested, right? In some ways, he's just an idiot. He has no filter. He just says the quiet part out loud. I don't think he even fully appreciates just how, when he gets mad and he's being a counterpuncher and he doesn't like Elijah Cummings like challenging him about the Muslim ban and so on, he just starts mouthing off. And so he starts saying the things that have become more popular on the right, but a lot of politicians were reluctant to say out loud, but he says them.
Definitely. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay.
I got mine answered.
All right. I'm trying to think of like how to end this. I'm gonna ask you a question that I did not. This is a topic we did not bring up, and actually, Spencer, I'm relying on Spencer to edit this out. If you're like, what? But hopefully, you won't have to. Have you guys done any research about people that did vote for Trump that are members of these out groups? Like,
did we? I'm sorry. I mean, like, I want to mention. So, like, we relied on a lot of different people who have great books out.
Okay.
So, like Ashley Jardina's White Identity Politics. I already mentioned Hacker and Pearson's Let Them Eat Tweets, but also Chris Parker and Matt Burrito's book about the Tea Party, which was very helpful. And all of these people, their research is covered in our book too. And so they reach more into this kind of an issue than we do. But you're saying, did we?
No, I just was wondering if you know anything, if anything stood out with people that I mean, you've seen it, like, Herman, God rest his soul, Herman Cain at the
Right.
at the Trump, at the Trump rally in the middle of the pandemic. I just was wondering if you had any insight on anything about folks that are members of these like out groups who are, you know.
Right. Well, first of all, there's so at the super spreading event for at the White House for Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court nomination. If you watch that film, at the end, you can see people like Chris Christie schmoozing with other people without masks on. Of course, he almost ended up dying because of that. But his face, you can see, like, he's like so proud. Him and Kellyanne Conway are talking. They're so proud that they're on the inside, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
got to be at the White House. They got to be
Mm-hmm.
close to power, and they
Mm-hmm.
get to repeal Roe versus Wade and so on. And so a lot of people, white and non-white, are just attracted to power.
Mm-hmm.
Herman Cain, I think, was a good example of that. He was a failed presidential candidate, and Ben Carson, also a failed presidential candidate. And Trump asked them if, well, can you help me? I need people in my administration, and not a lot of people in the middle, say moderate Republicans and so on, want to help me. I got to build a cabinet, and he attracted people, and some people are attracted to power, and that's why they were running in the first place. Ben Carson, and I guess figured, oh well, I'll at least get to do something regarding housing, which of course wasn't his area. But so you start to think, well, Ben Carson wasn't going to be a surgeon anymore. He wanted to do something larger with his life after a great career saving lives, and he wanted to do something more, and it didn't work out. But now he at least can be part of a powerful administration, and he's still in there. 50 Cent, is like, he just doesn't want to pay taxes.
Right.
Kanye West, has got mental health issues, and so it varies. I think the big thing here is lately is a lot of Latinos are attracted to Trump way more than we thought. It's kind of surprising. So part of it is, first of all, the Latino population is very diverse, right? So a lot of people we call part of the Latinx population are Cuban Americans. Well, they're very different than Puerto Rican Americans,
Mm-hmm.
or you know Haitian Americans, who might be biracial or what have you, and so on. And I have a bunch of friends from the Caribbean, and like I know a lot of people from Jamaica for a variety of reasons over the years, and several of them don't consider themselves black, right?
Mm-hmm.
American, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're Jamaican,
Right.
right? And so it's you get like there's diversity in these categories, and so a lot of Latino men are like a lot of white men that are into like, oh, we want a strong guy to be president, a machismo factor, and so on, and for some reason that's more important than like whether or not we're going to get social justice,
Right.
and so
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even his support among African Americans is increasing, but it's so low, right? It's like less than 10% of African Americans are going to vote for Trump, but it's more like 8 now rather than 4
Mm-hmm.
percent of African Americans are leaning towards Trump.
Well, I guess this kind of just wraps up the interview. I guess just I don't know. Do you have any parting words for a person who is just nervous about this election and is nervous about the mainstreaming of racism and politics in general?
Well, so the conclusion of the book, as I said, goes over what a sad story we have to tell, but it ends on a happy note that people are rising up in reaction to this. And it's possible that a multiracial coalition of people with uh, warm feelings, not cold feelings towards outgroups, is going to respond to Trumpism and repudiate it, and that's a hopeful sign. And there's evidence that that's happening. And so we end our book on a positive note, though we do warn that given the history of the United States as a country steeped in racism, that it's always there. It might get beaten back to the fringe again, but it could rise up again in the future, and that requires us to be eternally vigilant in trying to promote a multiracial, inclusive democracy going forward. And we tell a sad story. We were very depressed at what we found, but we end on an optimistic note that change is coming. But we warn that we have to be vigilant.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's the biggest part for me is that we have to be vigilant and we just can't rest. I think that if we want a multiracial democracy, it needs to be something that we fight for forever, basically, in this country. So thank you again, Dr. Sanford Schram, co-author of Hard White, the mainstreaming of racism in American politics. I suggest everybody get a copy.
Yeah.
What I liked about, there were plenty of things I liked about this book, but what I liked about how it was written was that I thought it was very approachable language. You have a lot of empirical, evidence and data, but it's very easy to read and understand. So I really appreciated that about this book. So everybody go get a copy, and I guess
it'll be linked to our show notes.
Yeah, we'll make sure we link it.
Yeah.
And
there's an audio version that has come out this week.
So you narrate it? Are you narrating?
No. An actor from Hollywood, Christopher Grove, who does a lot of books, narrated it, and I've listened to it. My wife and I listened to it, and we really enjoyed. He makes me sound way smarter than. He has a good way with the language, and he has a good way with the language. So I highly recommend the audio, but there's also the ebook as well as the paperback, and so we're very excited about the book and most appreciative that you guys have asked me to come and talk about it. So thank you. I really
thank you.
Thank you.
It was good to see you guys.
Yeah, it was great seeing you, Sandy. I don't think I've seen you actually in person since, if I'm correct, it was actually maybe August of 2016, because I believe we were at the American Sociological Association meeting and we were talking about the election. And at the time, with the polls and everything, it looked like Hillary was going to win. And I think that was the last time we.
Oh, that was in Seattle.
Oh, was that Seattle? Okay.
I think.
You know what?
Or San Francisco.
Not to brag, but
I've
been really blessed that I've been able to go so many places with work. So sometimes the trips become a blur, but I do remember.
Oh, it was San Francisco.
We met up for dinner. It was a group of people in general.
Right.
I think one night we were able to meet up for dinner. We were talking about the election. So I do remember that specifically. The location somewhere on the West Coast, but it's been a while. So
it was great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. I can't wait until travel is really safe and having public lectures is safe again. And I'm sure I'll be somewhere that you are.
So, and that concludes this episode of Not Your Black Friends podcast. As always, you can find us on our social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at NYBF Podcast. You can also find us on our website at nybfpodcast.com. We like to interact with our listeners and viewers. Of course, as always, you can find our episodes on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and most other podcast aggregating services. And you can also find special episodes like this one on YouTube. So look us up, subscribe, share with your friends. We appreciate that. And with that, this has been another episode of the Not Your Black Friends podcast. I'm Spencer.
And I'm Tia.
Enjoy the rest of your week.